With the Jujutsu Kaisen manga finally entering its conclusion, pretty much every character in the cast has gotten their chance to shine, with Yuta, Maki and Yuji especially getting a lot of attention in their fights with Sukuna. However, there is a specific character who, for the last few months, hasn't really done much: Kinji Hakari. Jujutsu High suspended 3rd year, and one of the strongest sorcerers of the modern era has been relatively absent during the current arc of JJK. We've only really gotten one chapter with Hakari as the main focus, which was months ago, and in his last appearance, his fight with uraume ended in a pretty underwhelming manner. Because of this, a lot of people have begun to downplay him. In this video, me and Restless Gambler are going to go over how Hakari would do in a fight against the 4 registered special grades, those being Geto, Yuki, Yuta, and Gojo. We're also going to be doing Kinjaku since him being in Geto's body means he technically is a special grade sorcerer, so yeah, we might as well include him. Last thing before we get into the matchups, if you enjoy watching the video, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, as that would help me a ton, and that means I'll be able to get more videos out, so it's a win-win for both of us. And of course, also subscribe to Restless Gambler's channel as well. His link will be in the description. The first fight we're going to be talking about is Hakari versus Geto. Geto is probably considered by most people to be the weakest of the 4 special grades, and I mean, this makes sense, right? He has no RCT, no domain, and most of his feats come from very early into the series. It also doesn't help that we have Kinjaku, who's basically just Geto but improved in every single area. However, this doesn't mean that Geto is weak or anything. Even though he lost to Volume 0 Yuta, it was later stated that had Geto used all of his curses in this fight against Yuta, he most likely would have won. And in this fight against Hakari, we will be using a hypothetical Geto with all of his curses just to make things fair. So in regards to the fight itself, I'm just going to be honest and say it's not looking too good for Geto. In terms of physical stats, he's completely outmatched by Hakari, and we have a pretty direct line of scaling for this. Volume 0 Yuta on his own is able to basically blitz Geto through sheer speed, and even though you could say it was because Geto was surprised by Yuta's speed increase, the way Gege draws the panel, we can see Geto realize that Yuta's moving faster, and despite this, he still wasn't able to react. The way this links to Hakari is because there are multiple statements that imply that when it comes down to overall stats, like speed for example, Hakari should be around the same level as current Yuta. Not only does Gojo himself imply their relative when he says they should only step into the fight if he gets weakened to the point Hakari or Yuta could take him, but Kinjaku as well also groups Hakari, Yuta and Maki together, which insinuates they're at a similar level when he refers to them as the 3 heavy hitters. We can use this to link Yuta and Hakari's speed since Hakari is entirely a hand-to-hand fighter. It means for him to be in a similar level to Yuta, he'd have to at the very least have similar speed, if not be faster. Yuta has multiple curse techniques, has an extremely lethal domain, and has recut to make it a 2v1. And despite this, it still implied Hakari should be able to somewhat keep up with him. And again, since Hakari is a hand-to-hand fighter, the only way for him to do that would be for him to at least be in the same tier of Yuta when it comes to speed. With that out of the way, there is a very noticeable speed gap between Hakari and Geto. Hakari should be relative to current Yuta, who's faster than Sendai Yuta, who's faster than Volume 0 Yuta, and then that Yuta was able to blitz Geto. This can also be applied to the AP, with Volume 0 Yuta being able to damage Geto and Hakari scaling way above that. The only chance Geto really has is to either try to overwhelm Hakari with his curses before Hakari hits a jackpot, or manage to land a maximum Uzumaki on base Hakari. The problem with the first argument is that the strength of Geto's special grade curses are left pretty ambiguous. In fact, we only really know about one of them, which is a special grade Todo defeated, and this is Todo before the beginning of the series, so it's a weaker version of Todo, and he also had just fought 3 other grade 1s, meaning he was probably fatigued, and even then, this nerfed version of Todo was still able to take out one of Geto's special grades. Obviously Geto might have stronger ones, but since it's never actually stated or implied, I find it very hard to believe any of them will be able to give Hakari any trouble. It's also likely Geto just wouldn't be able to summon all of his curses while also having to fight off Hakari at close range. As for Uzumaki, even though it is an extremely powerful move, it doesn't seem to be that fast. Kusakabe was able to jump in front of Kinjaku and activate Simple Domain all within the time frame of Kinjaku charging his Uzumaki, and that's considering the fact Kusakabe is slower than Kinjaku. Hakari, who's faster than Geto, would probably be able to either pressure Geto enough so he wouldn't have the opportunity to use Uzumaki, or if Geto does attempt to use it, Hakari can just straight up close the distance and start beating him up. Even if Geto does manage to shoot Uzumaki, we know its speed should be somewhat relative to Rika's Blast, and by extension Ryu's Granite Blast, which Yuta was able to casually dodge, and since Hakari is in the same level of speed, he should also be able to do the same. So I don't want to say Geto gets slammed, but he does kinda get slammed. As I said previously, he might be able to get a win if he can overwhelm Hakari with his curses before Hakari hits a jackpot, but even then, Hakari was able to survive long enough to hit a jackpot against both Kashimo and uraume, which just makes it extremely unlikely that Geto's curses, which are at best not even as strong as Todo at the beginning of the series, would be able to kill Hakari in base, something 2 other special grade characters were unable to do.
Yuki Tsukumo is someone people rate rather high, and obviously for good reason. She was a special grade sorcerer even before Gojo and Geto. She has a broken curse technique and many other techniques that prove useful in battle. To be honest, I always respected her and put her above a lot of people, so how would she fare against someone like Hakari? Let's get into it. Yuki's main attribute when it comes to battle is her overwhelming power. Almost nothing else matters when her punches literally breaks concepts. In chapter 205, Kenjaku summons Ganesha, a cursed spirit that removes all obstacles in the way by entangling a concept on said obstacle. We saw this being used literally 4 chapters prior to the Fodder Soldiers of America, with Ganesha teleporting them into the air and dropping them. This same thing was meant to work on Yuki, but with one kick of Garuda, Ganesha was exercised. We find out that the reason Ganesha couldn't remove Garuda as an obstacle was because Yuki applied so much mass to it that there wasn't any concept that could contain it. In this case, there wasn't any concept that could make it move out of the way. She then goes around Kenjaku to punch him, to which he reacts and attempts to block, but both of his arms literally get deleted and he still punched through Tengen's barrier. I think it's safe to assume that Yuki has the strongest punches outside of Black Flashes in the entire series. No one would come close to a full power Yuki's punch. But notice how I emphasize full power. Yuki at the beginning of the battle is a huge threat, but during her fight with Kenjaku, we find out her weakness. After Kenjaku uses domain expansion on her and heavily damages her from being able to literally destroy concepts with her punches, now Kenjaku's taking kicks directly to the head and barely suffering any injuries. It's stated that because she's hurt, the output of her curse technique, Star Rage, is lower, so you would think healing up would fix it, but no, she continues to pile attacks on Kenjaku, but now they're so weak, Kenjaku takes 2 direct punches to the head, maneuvers around the 3rd punch, and goes on to hit her with 2 mini Uzumakis. When it came to speed, while she doesn't get slower from adding mass to herself, she hasn't shown any good speed feats. The first punch I talked about earlier was basically a surprise attack from around Kenjaku and through Ganesha, so a blind spot. But despite this, Kenjaku turned around and then blocked it. Now, here's something I realized a while ago that I didn't think made much sense, but it's just completely stated. Kenjaku's stats are equal to Geto's stats. As much as I downplay Geto, his body, his curse energy, that's all Kenjaku's. And so with that in mind, we literally see basically the exact same scenario happen, except Yuta didn't have a blind spot to utilize. And even then, Geto turns around but is still slashed by Yuta's blade. At the very least, you'd have to argue that Volume 0 baby Yuta would be relative in speed to yes, relative to speed to Yuki. And then Yuta goes through multiple training arcs, going out of the country, and can you guess who Yuta is constantly compared to? Yes, my guy Kinji Hakari. Before we get into him, I'll finish talking about Yuki. While her power is completely out of this world, her durability isn't all that great. She tanked Kenjaku's sure hit that was disabled by Tengen, but then after a couple of hits that did little damage to Kenjaku, she reaches her limit. Of course, she has RCT, but even so, she loses a ton of output on her curse technique. And then Yuki literally gets turned into a donut after taking 1 mini Uzumaki. Not a condensed one, because that would have been stated, an actual mini Uzumaki. Things aren't looking too good for Yuki. Going into Hakari, in comparison to Yuki, Hakari has nothing in his arsenal that can compete with Star Rage. Simple as that, Yuki will always punch harder at her fullest. But then we enter the problem of speed. Of course, in an actual fight, Hakari will always be the first one to open his domain. In it, he has so much cheese it's not even funny. He has pseudo spins to revert damage and different modes to guarantee him jackpot faster or slower. The only way Yuki will be able to kill Hakari will be if she can outpace his eventual jackpot. When Hakari enters jackpot, while again he can't match her punches, Hakari isn't getting hit by any of them. He at the very least is just faster than her in jackpot, but in character Hakari would just directly take the attack that Yuki throws at him because his regeneration is imminent. In jackpot, the only thing she can do to put him down is kick Garuda at his head and make it explode, which again is unlikely. It didn't even blitz Kenjaku. Hakari in jackpot scales to Shinjuku Yuta, and his weaker version in Sendai was taking direct hits from Ryu's Granite Blast, in specific his mini ones. Given he has the greatest curse energy output of anyone else, is it really bold to assume Granite Blast is stronger than Uzumaki? No, because we literally see it overpower Rika's Love Beam that overpowered Uzumaki. With a little bit of brain power, if you want to downplay Hakari to the max, Hakari was scaled to the mini Granite Blast that scaled above mini Uzumaki that took Yuki out of the fight. Of course, Hakari isn't just punching through Yuki, however with Hakari's speed and attack potency, these attacks will be heavy on Yuki. Her taking damage and regenerating will lower her own attack potency, and eventually Hakari's will just be outright stronger. So if these two fight 10 times, I'm giving Hakari the win 7 times out of the 10. Of course, the 3 times will be if Yuki manages to outpace Jackpot, but the other 7 is just Hakari beating her up. If push comes to shove, Hakari just completely outlasts her, but I don't even think it would come to that. There's also the black hole, but that's an automatic Yuki loss, so don't be talking about that in the comments.
Next up we have Gojo, and I'm just gonna be completely honest and say Hakari is getting cooked. Gojo has been stated multiple times to be the strongest sorcerer of the modern era, which just blatantly puts him above Hakari, and if that isn't enough, Gojo also managed to one-shot Uraume, the same Uraume who fought Hakari for almost 40 chapters. So for this section of the video, rather than talking about who would actually win the fight, I'm gonna instead focus on the ways in which Hakari might be able to get through Infinity, and also if Hakari has any way to survive Gojo's domain. So firstly, when it comes to Gojo's Infinity, there might actually be a way for Hakari to bypass it. We all know a domain short hit neutralizes defensive cut techniques, for example Infinity and Outer Transfiguration, but there are also some implications that just having a domain active is enough to bypass Infinity. We first see this in the fight between Gojo and Jogo. When Jogo opens his domain, he specifically mentions that inside the domain he'll be able to reach Gojo. The way Jogo words it makes it seem like the domain itself is making Infinity no longer active, and Gojo thus proceeds to confirm what Jogo said and that he will be able to go through Infinity. Though this is still pretty contentious since Jogo could have been referring to his short hit reaching Gojo rather than his Jujutsu as a whole. Me personally, I do think his statement implies Infinity is no longer active inside a domain, but again, it does come down to interpretation. The other time we see something similar happen is in the fight between Mahito and Mekamaru. This time, Mekamaru is able to nullify Mahito's Outer Transfiguration solely by using Symbol Domain. Since Symbol Domains don't actually have a short hit, it basically means Mekamaru's barrier itself is what's allowing him to damage Mahito despite his cut technique. Even though symbol domains are different from actual domain expansions, Mekamaru bypassing Outer Transfiguration does imply him creating a barrier is what makes it so he's able to hit Mahito. This should also work against Gojo's Infinity, since just like Mahito, it is a defensive cut technique which can be bypassed. If we take those two instances into account, I think it's very possible that Hakari inside his domain would be able to get through Infinity. If the barrier itself is what's neutralizing the technique, then Hakari inside Out of the Death Gamble should also be able to damage Gojo. This doesn't really change the fight, and even if Hakari can go through Infinity, he'd only be able to do so in base without Jackpot, but I do still think it's something interesting to note. The other thing I want to talk about is if Hakari could survive Gojo's domain, Unlimited Void. Now the answer to this question is definitely pretty vague and mainly depends on your interpretation, but there are ways you could argue for Hakari surviving it. The way Unlimited Void works is that it sends an infinite amount of information into your brain, basically leaving whoever gets hit by it stun-locked and unable to do anything. We also know from the Sukuna fight that the information overload you receive from Infinite Void does in fact physically damage your brain, where it's stated only 10 seconds inside Unlimited Void resulting in Sukuna taking significant brain damage. Now the way Hakari might be able to survive this would be mainly through Jackpot and his RCT. Hakari's RCT works differently to other characters in the way Hakari can actually heal himself subconsciously. In his fight against Kashimo, he's able to allocate and remove the poison from his body while not even being awake. And he's also able to dispel the cursed energy in his brain through his nose. Now against Unlimited Void, this might be a bit of a stretch. I do think there's a possibility that Hakari's brain constantly healing itself could result in Unlimited Void's info dump being constantly dispelled from Hakari's brain. So as his brain's getting overloaded with information, the RCT would keep healing his brain subconsciously, allowing Hakari to not take the full burn of Unlimited Void. Though this is mostly just headcanon and I am giving Hakari the benefit of the doubt, at the end of the day it doesn't really matter, since even if Hakari could get through Infinity and survive Unlimited Void, it's a pretty one-sided fight in Gojo's favor. I just wanted to present some ways Hakari might have a chance, but even then, the fight isn't all that interesting, unlike the next matchup.
Yuta vs Hakari is probably the reason you press on this video. Yeah, I can see it on your face. Luckily, you'll get what you're looking for. Yuta Okkotsu is a supremely strong combatant, boasting the title of the second strongest modern sorcerer behind Gojo. He is one of Jujutsu Kaisen's greatest prodigies, and this claim is supported by the fact that his power stems from instinctive mastery of Jujutsu's highest forms of sorcery. He gained a domain expansion 1 year into being a sorcerer, he gained RCT in his first months, and became a special grade twice. Despite all this, his senpai Kinji Hakari is still compared to him by the narrative, by Yuta, and by our favorite character, Mr. Six Eyes himself, Gojo Satoru. When it comes down to it, these two are neck and neck at full power. In chapter 146, Yuta directly says that Hakari on the roll, referring to Jackpot, is stronger than him. Maki of course claims his cap, but at the very least, there is relativity there. Even as early as chapter 11, both Hakari and Yuta, who we knew had immense strength from volume 0, were stated to be able to reach the heights of Gojo one day by the man himself. There's also the fact that in chapter 234 it stated Gojo said they should only help him if he becomes weaker than Hakari and Yuta. These two are extremely relative, and just because we haven't seen the things Hakari can do post time skip doesn't mean that whatever Yuta is doing just puts him above him. When comparing these two, I think the best thing to do is to compare their fights between Kashimo and Ryu. Before you go raging in the comments, yes, this is pre-time skip, but the fact does still stand that after the time skip, they're still extremely relative. I mainly want to focus on Hakari's encounters in Jackpot compared to Yuta's encounters in his 5-minute mode. If you actually go and reread these fights, Hakari and Yuta are almost always dominating their opponents, and on the off chance that they aren't, they immediately retaliate. Hakari and Kashimo in chapter 188 started off the Jackpot round mostly relative, with Hakari taking heavy blows from Kashimo, who attempts to kill him during his immortality. But immediately when Hakari decides to pick up the pace because Jackpot is ending, he literally blisses Kashimo and dominates him in hand-to-hand combat. Kashimo even knows that he's moving even faster, and it's because Hakari decided to try even harder. Yuta on the other hand mostly does the same thing, as when he engages with Ryu, he's able to match it with Love Beam but then outwit him by using Sky Manipulation. If you notice, these two just aren't comparable to their opponents when they go full power, but what about the path to said full power? I'll let Heavy talk about that.
So as Gandalf said, Yuta and Hakari are definitely implied to be relative to each other in some way, both via feats and the overall narrative of the story. However, I think where a lot of people have an issue with Hakari is the conditions he needs to meet to get to the level of Yuta. While Yuta can just go into his 5-minute mode or activate his domain whenever he wants, Hakari has to actually hit a jackpot, and this is where Hakari's biggest weakness comes from, his vulnerability in between jackpots. He essentially has to hit jackpots if he wants to fight top tiers, so how likely is it for him to actually do it versus Yuta? Well, it is very likely. First of all, Winner Hakari in base should be able to hold his own for a pretty long time against Yuta. Base Hakari was able to survive against Uraume and Kashimo, two people who in character are way more likely to go for the kill, and two people who also scaled to Yuta. Because of this, I think it's fair to say Yuta is probably not killing Hakari before he hits his initial jackpot. I mean, not only is base Hakari just overall pretty strong, but his domain also grants him an amp, and things like rerolls just make it overall extremely hard to kill him. With all that included, I personally do think Hakari would be able to survive long enough to hit his initial jackpot. But there is also another way Yuta could prevent Hakari's jackpot, and that would be by opening his own domain. Now this part of the video is extremely contentious since Gege makes it pretty ambiguous as to how a domain clash between these two would go. Yuta has recently gotten many statements hyping up his domain, such as his barrier technique being praised by Sukuna, and now we're getting the reveal that he improved through the switch training with Gojo. However, Hakari is the only character in the entire manga to get a statement specifically regarding his advantage in Tug of Wars. Not only is Hakari's domain extremely refined as it's an extension of his cut technique, but he also trades his harmless short hit for faster activation speed and a boost in Tug of Wars. While Yuta's domain statements are mostly referring to barrier technique, Hakari's statements specifically mention Tug of Wars. And because of that, I do think if Hakari and Yuta were to domain clash, Hakari would probably come out on top, and this is where Hakari's main win from comes from. If he's able to beat Yuta in a domain clash, the fight goes extremely in his favor. But even if he can't, as long as base Hakari is inside his own domain, he should be safe from Yuta's own domain. And as soon as Hakari hits jackpot, he should also be safe because of his RCT. Even though Hakari doesn't have the highest AP, he should still be able to damage Yuta given the fact they're implied relative. Which means in the fight between the two, given enough time, it's possible Hakari would force Yuta into running out of CE eventually. We saw in Sendai it was implied Yuta's own cut energy was already dropping, so if he's fighting Hakari and constantly using RCT and domain expansion, the same thing would also happen. I'm not saying this means Hakari would win the fight, I'm just stating what is possibly his most definitive win con. The truth is, we don't really know how a domain clash between the two would go, so I personally think the fight could go either way. It is also possible for Yuta to kill Hakari in between his jackpots, so if you think he can do that, then yeah, he would win the fight, but if you don't think that's the case, then the fight becomes very debatable, and in the end, it just comes down to your personal interpretation.
For this fight, we have the wild card, Kinjaku. Kinjaku is a funny case because I think everyone respects his prowess but never realizes that the thing that makes him so dangerous is actually his experience as a sorcerer. He has top 2 barrier skill, he has immense knowledge on curse techniques, he has reversal techniques, RCT, and implies to have domain counters like Hollow Whisker Basket and Simple Domain. It's all this stuff that makes Kinjaku so crazy. But when it comes to an actual battle like hand to hand or speed, he really isn't all that. Reminder that this isn't Kinjaku's fault, this is Geto's fault. Did you know Gege said Kinjaku would have trouble taking in Mahito and Jogo through curse spirit manipulation? Kinjaku would have trouble whittling down those 2 disaster curses. I truly think this is because of his lack of stats we'll go into right now. One thing I will say is that Kinjaku is at the very least faster than uraume. Something people like to use against them is the reaction to piercing blood, but the fact of the matter is, uraume knew of piercing blood but didn't know what it did. Regardless of that fact, they still managed to block it. Kinjaku on the other hand knew literally everything about it because Choso was his son, even knowing that it's only fast when you first send it. Uraume's reaction here isn't an anti-feed by any means, and upon finding out its contents, like poison, Uraume wouldn't just outright block to gauge what it is. This conversation is relevant to this video because Hakari is fighting Uraume right now and has been for a very long time. But the thing is, Jackpot Hakari as we see it in chapter 245 just dominates them. There is no instance where Uraume is able to damage Hakari when he doesn't let them. At the beginning of the fight, instead of thinking in his head that he's cooked, he said it out loud to let Uraume know that he thinks he's finished. That's why they say game over. They think that Hakari knows he's finished. Notice how in the first page Hakari sees the attack coming, but there isn't a spark anywhere in his reaction. It's because Hakari never gets blitzed by it, he lets it hit him. If you think this is cope, in the next couple pages Hakari blisses Uraume with his literal regeneration, and you see the spark in their reaction because they got blitzed. So Hakari doesn't scale to Uraume in speed as much as people want to insinuate. Of course, Hakari isn't Gojo levels above them because the fight wouldn't be this long if that was the case, but Hakari is just faster. Kenny is in the body of a guy who got blitzed by Baby Yuta, and Shinjuku Yuta, a Yuta 2 training arcs later, is stated relative to Hakari. I don't think it's far-fetched to assume Hakari and Jackpot would be just a tiny bit faster than Kinjaku, even if you want to downplay him to the highest of extremes. The problem here is how Hakari gets to Jackpot. Hakari would, again, be the first to expand his domain, but Kinjaku is that guy. With an open domain and Hakari's domain being the only domain in the entire series with a statement about tug of wars, at the very least we can say that they be evenly matched. In the domain, Kinjaku would have to box for Hakari, and we see that base Hakari could come out of his domain unscathed by Uraume. No hand-to-hand combat is defeating Hakari in that domain, that's for sure. And so in Jackpot, it all comes down to Kinjaku's battle IQ. We see in chapter 239, Kinjaku cuts off reverse curse technique from Hazanoki. The thing is though, Hakari is aware of when people try to take reverse curse technique out of his arsenal. In chapter 186, when Kachimo's lightning is aimed for his head, Hakari moves out of the way, sacrificing his arm instead. Hakari wouldn't just let Kinjaku enter a couple cursed spirits into his neck. While Hakari might be reckless because he has RCT, he isn't stupid. You think Uraume hasn't tried to go for his head this entire fight, especially given that they have RCT themselves? It's a ridiculous claim. And so this fight honestly would just go either way, but with Kinjaku's versatility and battle IQ, I'd give him the win 6 times out of 10.
As always, if you enjoyed watching the video, please make sure to like, subscribe to mine and the rest of Gamba's channels if you haven't already. He makes great content for both One Piece and JJK, and yeah, he helped me a ton with making this video. We also recorded a different version of this video on his channel, where instead of Hakari, we talk about how Kachimo would do against the special grades, so make sure you guys go watch that. Other than that though, thanks for watching and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.